Hello, everyone. My name is Nimrod Goren. I'm the founder and head of Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. I hope you can all hear me well. With me is Gabriel Mitchell, who is the Director of External Relations at Mitvim, and also doing research at our institute. And we are delighted to have you here with us today to introduce you to the findings of our annual foreign policy public opinion poll. Mitvim has been conducting for 8 consecutive years in cooperation with the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, our longtime partners, an annual poll that is checking what Israelis are thinking about their country's foreign policy on many issues, ranging from Israel's foreign service to Israel's relation with its immediate neighbors and with the countries of the world, and priorities for our government and Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking and regional cooperation, and much more. We already have knowledge of 8 years, so we can compare the findings of this year to the ones of the previous ones. And today we will try to share with you the key findings from the poll, not all of them, and enable some conversation, questions and answers with you about their meaning. It's not only numbers, these numbers reflect trends, reflect attitudes, reflect developments, both in Israeli policies and what the public thinks. In Israel, foreign policy attitudes are related to official policies and they impact each other, and we'll try to figure out this interaction as well. So I will share with you the presentation we have made today. What I will ask is for those not speaking to be on mute. You can, throughout the debate or discussion or presentation, share on the chat box questions you may have. So after Gabi and myself will conclude our presentation, you will be able to write your questions and we'll answer them and try to give as much insight as possible. So the public opinion poll that we are sharing with you today is conducted among a sample of the Israeli adult population. It has a sample size of 700, including both Jewish and Arab respondents, with a margin of error of 3.5%. It is being carried out by Rafi Smith, who is one of Israel's leading pollsters, conducting many public opinion polls on political manner. The poll is representative, so it doesn't only have the Arab sample, but it is also gender balance. Among the background questions that we ask respondents to provide information about, we can also see the political leaning. And I must say that this year's poll is very reflective of a right-wing public opinion. 68% of our respondents identify themselves as either center-right or right-wing in the Israeli political spectrum, while only 13%, 1/3, are center-left or left. Okay, so to keep this in mind when you see the findings, because they represent what the Israeli center-right and right mostly thinks. Although we do try to share with you data that is representing what supporters of specific parties or representatives of specific population groups think about. Okay, so you'll also see them as we go along. And we'll present the findings along the categories. Some I will present and some Gabi will. The first question that we will show you the findings of relate to general assessments of the Israeli public about general issues relating to how foreign policy is being conducted in Israel. These are questions we ask year after year. First, the question about Israel's global standing. Respondents were asked to rank between 1 low to 10 high. As you can see, the averages on those questions are quite mediocre. Israel's global standing ranked at 5.63 out of 10. This is a drop from last year, while the other two indicators, both the government's handling of foreign policy, ranked at 6.05, and the status of Israel's foreign ministry, 5.69, both of them have been on the rise almost consecutively since 2015. You can see below that those who are the most satisfied or pleased with how Israel's foreign policy is being conducted are those voters who are either Likud supporters, the right-wing party that is governing Israel, or those voters of the ultra-Orthodox party, both the Ashkenazi, Yadut HaTorah, and the Sephardic Shas. If we look at these trends over time, and I will ignore for the moment the finding about Israel-US relations, which Gabi will speak about, you can see how the data is slowly going up from a peak of down in 2015. 2015 was the year that just after the election that took place that year, Netanyahu, prime minister, refrained from appointing a full-time foreign minister, and the public discourse at the time was very much focused on the weakness of Israel's foreign service, Israeli diplomacy, and that is reflected in the findings of that year. And since then, you see this improvement that is in line with how Netanyahu tries to present himself to the public as this mega statement, a very significantly successful diplomat. Okay, so the public buys that, but to a limited account, because still the numbers are mostly between 5 and 6, which out of 10 is quite a low ranking. We try to evaluate how the Israeli public sees basic values related to foreign policy. And this year we looked at equality, Jewish-Arab equality, and democracy. And we tried to look at those values through developments that happened in recent years in Israeli foreign policy. Israel, for the first time this year, appointed an Arab diplomat as an ambassador, okay, a Bedouin diplomat. And we asked Israelis whether they support or oppose the appointment of Arab diplomats as Israeli ambassadors. We got a very clear answer. 48% of the Israeli public supports Arab diplomats as ambassadors, while only 21% are against. This finding is more or less runs across this entire political spectrum, with only the religious sample and the under 29 years of age sample opposing that. The other question relates to democracy. As you may know, Israel is facing challenges to its democratic system and has been aligning itself with leaders in the global community that are not necessarily committed to the values of liberal democracy, partly because they may support Israel's policy on the Palestinian issue. So what we found in that question is still the most Israelis would prefer Israel to be investing in developing cooperation with countries that are democratic, even though they are not supportive of Israel's policies on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And that is also including supporters of what used to be a nationalist party, Israel Beitenu, which for us was a surprise. That's a party that eventually did not enable Netanyahu to form a right-wing government this time. And its voters, as you will see in other questions, are quite mixed in how they view foreign policy issues. I will hand over to Gabi to present about the state of Israel-US relations.
Thanks, Nimrod, and good afternoon or good morning to everyone, wherever you may be. As the graph in front of you indicates, the general perception of US-Israel relations is quite high, and if we were to go back to the original slide that demonstrated change over time, the state of US-Israel relations, at least in terms of public perception, has risen increasingly over the last 5 years, in large part due to the public perception that President Donald Trump is not only a good president for Israel, but because of the personal relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, which is something that both Netanyahu and members of his government have tried to cultivate over the last 4 years. It's important to identify the fact, or at least highlight the fact, that regardless of political background or leaning, this seems to be a consensus perspective amongst the majority of Israelis that US-Israel relations are positive. And it's an interesting kind of opening for commentary as to whether the perception of relations are solely based on the engagement between the two heads of state, and whether there's opportunity for more nuanced questions in the future in the possibility, that Trump were to lose and there would be a different president in the White House. In terms of how Israelis responded to the question of who they would rather win the US presidential election, there was a very clear sign that Israeli Jewish voters, and in particular center and center-right voters, were in favor of Donald Trump, and that left voters in Israel, and in particular Arab voters, were in favor of Biden. But it's important to identify as well that amongst the Arab population, nearly 50% did not respond to the question. They did not have an opinion, one president versus another president, which may generally reflect a degree of dissatisfaction with both candidates or disinterest in who actually wins the election. Have been other polls that have come out over the last couple of days that have indicated that perhaps the numbers in our poll are modest in comparison. There have been polls that have demonstrated that maybe somewhere around 65, as many as 70% of Israelis would prefer Donald Trump to be elected on November 3rd, which stands in stark contrast to polling data that came out this morning, which indicated that amongst American Jews, those statistics are actually the reverse. That 70% of polled American Jews support a presidential candidate of Joe Biden, and 30% of American Jews would support President Trump. So there's an interesting reversal that's taking place amongst these two core communities. We also asked our audience, and this is something that we've asked for many, many years, to identify countries in the world that are deemed most important to Israel outside or excluding the United States. And as you can see from the graph, Russia and Germany were the two most significant or most important countries as identified by the participants in the poll. Each participant had the opportunity to identify on their own 3 countries. We did not present the names of countries, they did not choose them in advance. They were given all of the opportunities and all the countries in the world to select, and of the selections that they made, Russia was the most significant, receiving 35 of both first and second and third choice ballots, and Germany the second. It's important to note that aside from the countries that appear on the screen, the UAE and Saudi Arabia both received 8% of votes. Jordan received 7%, and amongst Arab respondents to our poll, the Palestinian Authority received 12%, which is an interesting little wrinkle within the polling itself. Of these countries, one of the most significant ones, just in terms of long-term statistical data, is the shift that took place with Russia. This is the lowest percentage that Russia has received within this poll since 2014, but even then, it is still deemed the most significant country outside of the United States. And Germany, strong and consistent with both positive responses both on the political right and the political left of the spectrum. One of the questions that we've been asking over the last couple of years is, to what region do Israelis believe their country belongs? Is Israel part of Europe? Is Israel part of the Middle East? And obviously this depends on political affinities, cultural association. There's so many ways that this question can be interpreted. But one of the things that we have seen is that there's a significant division amongst Israelis as to where their country belongs. And this is one of the first times where, this is one of the first times in which it seems that the Mediterranean option, or some kind of placement within the Mediterranean basin, is increasing to the point which perhaps in the coming years it could eventually be one of the dominant answers. But it's obvious that Israelis aren't quite sure which geopolitical region they belong in. More Jews, ironically, say that Israel belongs in the Middle East, and more Arabs say that Israel belongs in Europe. We've also been asking for many years about Israel's relationship with Turkey. Israel, Turkey have had many ups and downs over the last decade, opportunities to reconcile their diplomatic relations. And one of the interesting trends that we've seen, at least this year, is that 56% of respondents responded, yes, Israel should try to improve its relations with Turkey. Now, it's important to clarify that over the last decade, Israel has also strengthened its bilateral relationships with many other actors in the region. And there are opportunities for cooperation between Israel and countries like Greece and Cyprus, who have a long history of mutual grievances and tensions with Turkey. This summer alone, there were tensions between Turkey and Greece, which are still in the process of being hashed out and resolved via NATO and other European and international actors. So we asked our audience this year, we asked them whether in a conflict between Turkey and Greece and Cyprus, what Israel should do. And it's clear that the 44% believed that Israel should remain neutral, that despite the fact that it's strengthened these bilateral partnerships with other countries in the region, that the conflicts, the historical conflict between various actors is not a part of Israel's business, and it should stay in some way neutral or distant from it. And very, very, very few respondents said that there should be support for Turkey, even though there was, a percentage, almost a quarter of the respondents said there should be some support for Greece and Cyprus. So there's an interesting divide within the respondents to this poll of a desire to strengthen bilateral relations with Turkey, but at the same time, not go so far as to damage relations that Israel has fostered with other regional actors, which seems to be along the lines of how the Israeli government has tried to manage the very delicate balance in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Thank you, Gabi. I will continue with relations with Europe and the Middle Eastern countries. And a question that is of much interest for us is how Israel is perceived the EU. Because over the last few years, we have seen a very confrontational language coming from the Israeli leadership towards Brussels that runs in contrast to the deep cooperation that exists between Israel and Europe. And during the last, 3-4 months, the new Israeli Foreign Minister, Gabi Ashkenazi, has been trying to change course and adopt a more open language towards the European Union. He met with the European foreign ministers. He's developed a relationship with High Representative Joseph Borrell. But Israelis in general still tend to see the EU more of a foe to Israel than a friend, although the gap between those saying foe and friend has been narrowing along the last couple of years. If we were speaking about a 37% gap 2 years ago, now the gap is 14%. So there is a trend that is improving in a way how the EU is perceived in Israel, but still a very long way to go until there is a correlation between the deep friendship and cooperation between the entities, and now they're being perceived by the public or reflected by the leadership. And like other questions which we related to already, also here there is a very big difference between the positions of the Arab population in Israel, which sees the EU as a friend of Israel, to the position of the Jewish majority in Israel. Going to relation with the Middle East, and of course the main development that happened just before this poll was conducted was the normalization agreement reached between Israel and the UAE. The poll was conducted 3 weeks after the announcement about the normalization, but before the actual ceremony in the White House. So there was a big hype about the UAE in the Israeli media and public debate at the time. Generally, what we see is that a large majority of Israelis, 74% versus 14%, now believe that cooperation with Middle Eastern countries is possible. This is the highest number we've seen on this question since 2014. It represents a shift in the mindset of Israelis from a perception of living alone in a hostile region to living in a region that is willing more and more to accept Israel within it. And the perception that cooperation is possible may open up doors to different perception also on the conflict with the Palestinians. That's at least what we're trying to do at Mitvim. When we try to understand what this cooperation should be about, and we took the UAE as an example because that's a country that cooperation with it is now evolving and developing, we say that the economic dimension has become very significant. In the past, when Israelis were thinking about cooperation with other countries in the Middle East, they were usually thinking about security cooperation. But with the UAE, although there was a debate about the selling of F-35 planes by the US to the UAE and all the security dimensions of the agreement vis-a-vis Iran, still Israelis rank as number one the economic dimension and the economic potential of this relationship. The civil component, which is sports and culture and academia, is ranked very low. Only 5% of the public sees value or top value in this domain, and this is something that we think should be improved because relation with the region should also have a strong civilian component, not only a political or security or economic one. We then try to assess how Israelis look at Arab countries, both from the security or strategic point of view, but also from their personal interest in those countries. We asked Israelis which Arab country is it most important for Israel to develop cooperation with. And you can see that Saudi Arabia is very clearly heading the poll, 24% compared to 12 with Egypt and 11 with the UAE. Last year, Saudi Arabia and Egypt were almost neck to neck. This year, the rise of the UAE, especially within the Jewish sample, not among the Arab sample, kind of changed its balance. And Saudi Arabia, not the countries that Israel has peace agreements with, not Egypt, not UAE, not Jordan. And look at the numbers of Jordan in both slides. Jordan is very low. Jordan, which is a strategic partner of Israel, of real importance to our security, is not perceived as such an important country by the Israeli population, and that may reflect why bilateral relations between Israel and Jordan are now at a very low point. The public does not see much importance in that relationship. So Saudi Arabia is ranked as the most important country for Israel in the Middle East, but when Israelis are asked, where would you like to go? Which Arab country would you like to visit? Assuming everything is okay and we have normal relations, then the United Arab Emirates, with all the positive vibe about it in the Israeli media, with all the economic flair that goes with it, is the number one destination by far that Israelis would like to visit. For us, the findings that are of interest in this question is not only the countries that people mentioned, but also the percentage, the very high percentage of Israelis who do not want to have any relation with the region to which Israel belongs. 42% of Israelis would not like to visit any Arab country, even if there is peace. 28% do not want Israel to develop cooperation with any Arab country. Okay, this means that although there is a very positive discourse about regional cooperation, still there is a chunk of our population that wants to detach and to separate Israel from its neighborhood in the Middle East. We asked the sample about some foreign policy issues that the government could advance, and we asked to rank each of them on a scale of 1 to 10. It was not a comparison question. They didn't have to rank them, but if you see, according to the numbers, most of the numbers are quite similar to each other. But what is important for us to note is how low the issue of advancing peace with the Palestinians is. And this is reflective in other aspects of our poll. The Palestinian issue has been sidelined. The Israeli population is currently not minded. The Israeli-Palestinian peace process or conflict, it does not see it as a priority for the government to deal with or as an interest of the public to advance peace. So while cooperation with the region is viewed very favorably, the Palestinians are lagging behind. This is very different among Israel's Arab population. Among the Arab sample, resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was ranked number 1. Okay, among the Jewish sample, you can see where it was. It was last out of 5. This is also reflected in answers to questions relating to the future steps after the signing of the agreement with the UAE. We asked the Israelis what would they like to see after this agreement has been reached. Should the Israeli government try to reach similar agreements with other Arab countries, or should it now turn the focus to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and try resolving it? And as you can see, the numbers are very clear. 61% of Israelis would like more agreement with more Arab countries. Only 24% prefer action to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is the most immediate and perhaps the most significant concern to Israel's identity, national security, democracy, foreign policy. So here we see a gap between our analysis at Mitvim about the importance of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process to Israel's foreign policy and how the public views that. But on the more positive side, if Israelis are asked how do they think the agreement with the UAE will impact chances for peace with the Palestinians, still a much higher percentage thinks that there are chances for increased prospects for Israeli-Palestinian peace, rather than those thinking that the Israel-UAE agreement actually decreases the prospects. And on that, there is a very clear left versus right divide within the sample. Left-wing voters, although as you saw before, there are not many of them, very clearly give preference to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, both in terms of the first question and the second one. When we go more into the Palestinian issue, we ask what are the perceptions within the Israeli population about the suspension of Israeli annexation plans in the West Bank. Because as you recall, there was a supposedly plan by Prime Minister Netanyahu to annex territories in the West Bank, which was dropped in parallel to the reaching of the agreement with the UAE. We ask Israelis whether this is a good or bad thing for Israel, and the answer is very clear, not only in terms of the numbers and the gap between those saying good or bad, but also in terms of how this is distributed among the different subgroups that we have evaluated. And almost on all the political divide, including Likud voters, including Israel Beitenu, the party I mentioned before, there was a gap in favor of those saying that suspending annexation was good for Israel, even Netanyahu's party. Only Yamina, which is the far-right party, and the ultra-Orthodox parties were the ones that thought that suspending annexation was a bad thing. And as in other questions in the poll, we saw some gap between the age groups and the younger population. Also here was tending more to the right. The gap between those saying good and bad among under 29 years of age respondents was the smallest. It was only 4% for those saying it is good for Israel to drop annexation. So that age group is worrying for us because it showed similar tendencies on other questions as well. And the other question we asked was about Gaza. We often hear about escalation in Gaza and chances for another war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And we tried to see whether Israelis think that another war in Gaza is avoidable, or whether it's, as some politicians claim, inevitable. 1/3 of the population sees a war as inevitable, and the others, surprisingly, do not attach much importance to the main mechanism that have been preventing wars from happening over the last years, namely international mediation. Now, efforts by the UN, Mladenov, and the Egyptians, and the Qataris, and others have been able to stop escalation from happening time and time again, but still in the eyes of Israelis, international mediation is the least effective tool to prevent a war. So these spaces where we identify a gap between what happens on the ground in reality and where the public perceptions are ones in which we are inclined to intervene more in order to try and shape the public discourse to a different direction. And another topic on which we try to act upon is the issue of international incentives for peace. Over the last few years, the international community has acknowledged the need to present Israelis and Palestinians with a coherent, coordinated package of positive incentives to promote peace. This was acknowledged in the International Peace Conference in Paris, by the Foreign Affairs Council of the EU, by China, by others, but that package was never developed, never presented. What we saw in our poll was that if that package would actually be put on the table, at least on the Israeli side, it will have quite a significant impact to the better, strengthening the support of key populations in peace with the Palestinians, namely parties among the Israeli center and center-right, but also quite a large number of Likud voters, 37%, that said that such a package will strengthen or very much strengthen their support for Israeli-Palestinian peace. These are the findings that we wanted to share with you, and you can see all of them on our website and the report we send out. And now we'll try to take some of your questions, either digging deeper on these findings, whether something is not clear, or do you want to go from them to other questions on Israel's foreign policy? Because at Mitvim, we do this annual public opinion poll, but this is not the major thing we are doing all along the year. We are doing research, we are doing policy analysis, we are developing recommendations, we are advising diplomats and politicians, so we have much on our plate beyond the numbers, as important as these numbers are. I will hand over to Gabi to lead us through the Q&A session.
Sure, and I just want to remind anyone who has a question and has not submitted it to please submit via chat. If we feel like the chat isn't the best format, we can, in theory, open it up Nimrod, there's a question about how normalization between Israel and the UAE enhance the peace process with the Palestinians. How does that work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's something that needs to further be elaborated because it's not clear as things are happening now. Okay, definitely there is a component of how this impacts the domestic Israeli discourse. Okay, what happened in Israel over the last couple of months is from a discourse focusing on annexation and security threats and dangers, we now have a more positivist debate about Israel and the region. One that emphasizes prospects for cooperation and hope, and even the word peace, which we didn't hear much in the Israeli media during the last few years, is repeated time and time again. There is also more sense of security in the region. Israelis could not anymore argue that they are not accepted in the region, that they are surrounded by countries that want to kick us out of the map. This is not the case anymore. So once there is a more positive attitude, plus a more sense of security, if mobilized by the political echelon, I think that public opinion can also be more open to concessions and compromises on the Palestinian issue. And then if we are looking toward a possible change in the White House, and if there will be American administration taking a different path towards a two-state solution, and the UAE will want to be on board with that, I think it could be somewhat of a good agent of change looking into prospects of that, especially once there will be political change in the Palestinian leadership. I think that's the place where the UAE will want to intervene and engage and maybe help set the stage for better prospects for engagement with Israel in the future.
There was also a question, Nimrod, regarding the EU and the question about perception of the EU as a foe or as a friend, and what the reasons are as to why Israelis potentially perceive of the EU as a foe, if it's related to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, or perhaps there's more at stake. One of our staff members, Maya Tzion-Tzidkiyahu, who's the program director for Israel-Europe relations, gave a response in the text. I'm not going to read it verbatim, but I'm curious as to whether you could weigh in as well on this subject.
So first, there's a combination, a traditional combination of how Israel-Europe relations look like, and you have historical grievances that are very much decisive in defining the relationship, plus political differences. The EU, since 1980, has been calling for the establishment of a Palestinian state, and this is something that Israeli governments, right-wing governments over the last decades refused to do. The EU is creating a linkage between the level of bilateral relations it has with Israel to what is happening between Israel and the Palestinians, saying only if there is progress on the peace process, then Israel could significantly upgrade its relation with Israel. And the previous Netanyahu government, the one serving until we had the consecutive election cycles, was bashing the EU, criticizing the EU for double standards, singling out Israel, financing organizations supporting boycott, even financing terror organizations. So there was a very clear campaign painting the EU in a very negative picture. That spilled over to the public opinion. The Israeli public knows a lot about specific countries in Europe, but it does not really understand what the European Union is and how it functions. Having said that, as I mentioned before, there is such a wide range of cooperation happening between Israel and the EU in so many fields. Just this year, there will be a renewal of the research and development program, Horizon, which basically helps Israel's research community develop and invent and progress. And the EU also put forward both to Israel and the Palestinians an offer to establish a special privileged partnership, bringing both sides almost to full EU membership once they reach peace with each other. So it's not only about negative incentives and pressure, it's also about positive ideas that have been generating from Brussels and that create a platform that could lead Israel and the EU to better and friendlier relations.
Great. Thank you. We had a question regarding Jewish support or Jewish respondents who suggested that Israel belongs in the Middle East as opposed to in Europe, and Arab respondents who suggested that Israel is a part of Europe. Why is that the case? I'll give a crack at it, although I don't think that there's any clear or singular reason as to why that could be the case. Culturally, Israel is very much a blend of its respective population, some of which originated in Europe, many of which originated in the Middle East. And so for some Israeli Jews, they've always lived in the Middle East and they continue to live in the Middle East. I'm sure that some of the respondents answered the question in terms of maybe ideological or values-based affinities, perhaps closer towards Europe, or perhaps they answered the question geographically, where is Israel located? Well, we're in the Middle East, so we should belong in the Middle East, right? There's so many different ways of addressing a question like this, and I think that's part of the reason why you see a diverse range of options. Many years ago, we didn't include the Mediterranean basin as an answer, and since including that, we've noticed, a shift towards perhaps the Mediterranean, which is neither Middle Eastern nor European. It's somewhere in the middle. It's something, maybe it's unique and different, but it definitely has a combination of all things. I haven't been involved in the poll as many years as you have. I'm going to give you a question which is related to Germany's perception as one of the most important countries for Israel. Why did it rise since 2019, or what do you think are the reasons as to why the total percent rose a little bit since 2019, but not the other countries that are listed in the top 6, China, Russia, UK, etc.?
I would say that Germany, its relationship with Israel is quite stable. So when Israelis think about the importance of Russia, I don't think they perceive some very strong alliance between Israel and Russia that is either value-based or based on a historical commitment or a political affinity. It's more kind of ad hoc interest. And whether Russia is more involved in the immediate neighborhood or less involved, that makes an impact. And definitely China, whether China is trying to invest or disinvest, and what the American position is. So Germany is, for decades, considered the most important supporter of Israel in Europe. You hear very clear messages coming from Berlin. The relationship is very deep. So I think that reflects in public opinion. The drop in the numbers, not only of Russia, but the others, were much because the rise of the Arab countries, which you mentioned in the presentation, Gabi, that Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Jordan, which received very low percentages in previous years, all of a sudden became more prominent. I think it's important that this is a diversity in how Israelis perceive the important countries in the world, but Germany is definitely out there as a source of stability, both in terms of its leadership, its position within the EU. Germany is now the president of the European Union this half year. So I think all of that together perceives why Germany is so important. Even our foreign minister, his first foreign travel was to Berlin. One of his first meetings was with the German foreign minister. So it reflects in day-to-day diplomacy as well.
Sure. There's a question about Egypt and the responses in the poll as to Egypt's importance and traveling to Egypt. Egypt being both one of the biggest tourism destinations in the world prior to coronavirus, and a significant business market as well. What's the sense, given everything that's happened between Israel and the UAE and the opportunities for normalization, what's the sense of where Egypt stands in comparison to all of the other Arab states that Israel has the opportunity to perhaps expand relations with or improve relations with?
So first, I would also like to note that we have a series of Mitvim experts with us on the call. So if any of my colleagues wants to pitch in and answer some of the questions, you are most welcome. We have a great team of experts at the Institute on dealing with all of these countries. So I'll try to give my shot, but you can do as well. Egypt, it has peace relation with Israel since 1979. We just marked 40 years of the peace agreement. A very stable relation that managed to overcome ideological changes within the regime in Egypt after the Arab Spring, when the Muslim Brotherhood came to power and maintained the peace agreement with Israel. Currently, President Sisi is a strategic partner of Prime Minister Netanyahu. They've been developing their personal relationship. They've managed to take the security cooperation between the countries into the open, especially what was happening in Sinai in recent years, acknowledged by Sisi publicly in some of his media interviews. about how Israel is helping Egypt combat extremism and terrorism in Sinai. And Gabi, within your field of East Med and energy, we saw how Israel is taking a leading role in the formation of the Cairo-based Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which has just been consolidated as an international organization, including Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and Jordan and Egypt and Cyprus and Greece and Italy, excluding Lebanon, with which we are launching talks today, indirect talks between Israel and Lebanon, excluding Turkey, but still another sort of cooperation between Israel and Egypt that also enables the Israel Ministry of Energy to travel to Egypt and appear there publicly in the media and beyond. So I think the economic dimension, the strategic dimension, the personal relationship between the leaders all create a bond that is very strong.
There's a question about the possibility, I assume after normalization between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, and potentially, in theory, other countries in the future, there's a question about what kind of engagement citizens of those countries could potentially have with Jerusalem, which is one of the Islamic world's most holy cities, and whether there is some kind of formula for travel or pilgrimage to Jerusalem that could in some way, shape, or form benefit the Palestinians. I know that this isn't a question related exactly to any of the questions that we asked in the poll, but it is an interesting question. So I feel like it's worth asking, just in terms of how we understand the relationship between the bilateral processes that are taking place between Israel and some of its neighbors and their neighbors' relationship with the Palestinians.
Yeah, so the exchange between people, I think, is a major component in that type of civilian cooperation that I mentioned before. We see it happening, for example, between Israel and Morocco, which do not have any formal ties, but still about 40,000 Israelis are going annually to visit Morocco. So the ability of people to meet each other, to go to each other countries is vital. When Israel and Turkey negotiated their 2016 reconciliation agreement, they also discussed the component of encouraging Turkish tourism into Jerusalem, to the holy sites, to Islam. I think the ability to visit those sites was also including in the agreements with the UAE and with Bahrain. It should be noted, however, that there are a lot of sensitivities on the Palestinian side to that, because when Saudi delegations came to visit Jerusalem after either playing football in Ramallah or meeting with NGOs in Jerusalem, they were welcomed in a very harsh way by the Palestinians, because it was seen as some sort of an acknowledgement of the Israeli control in Jerusalem, which goes against the narrative of the Palestinians. I think the way to leverage the ability to launch tourism cooperation with the Gulf, but doing that in a way that is conducive to Israeli-Palestinian relations and not portraying that as an anti-Palestinian move that basically is only leveraging the Israeli position and claim on the city. This is one of the challenges relating to the previous question of how do we make sure that this new relationship with the Gulf could actually be helpful to resolving the conflict with the Palestinians and not vice versa.
There's a question as well about American pressure on Israel and whether a continued American pressure on Israel will affect its relationship with China. China being listed in the top 3 or 4 countries by Israelis, or whether it's a temporary term. I'll answer it very briefly. This is a question that I don't think that many people have the answer to, although it seems that the relationship and the type of engagement between the United States and China will likely dictate a large degree of the geopolitical framework that we will see in the coming years, barring any kind of surprises. And Israel has tried to obviously have an open relationship and cooperative relationship with China, while recognizing its special relationship and special partnership with the United States. There have been a couple of incidences in which the United States, particularly Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, has come specifically to Israel to ask Israel to withdraw bids by Chinese companies to invest in Israel proper. Whether that's going to be a long-term trend will be dependent on the election and dependent on long-term U.S. strategy vis-a-vis China, which is difficult to predict 3 weeks before election day. There is another question, Nimrod, about our poll in general. That our poll, at least this year, didn't include any questions about Iran or Israeli perceptions of Iran policy, whether that be international policy vis-a-vis Iran or American policy vis-a-vis Iran. So there was a question about our analysis, or whether we have some kind of analysis about the Israeli government's policy on Iran, and any possible gaps that may exist between the United States and Israel in the event that Joe Biden is elected.
So in general, we saw an alliance between the Trump position on Iran and the ones advocated by Netanyahu. We saw Israeli government officials go to European capitals and try to convince the Europeans to join in the policy led by the Americans. So I think there's a very clear direction by Israel towards Iran. We also saw the campaign to label the Hezbollah as a terror organizations among different countries, and how that was prioritized by the Israeli Foreign Service. And also in terms of the relation with the Gulf, although it's very often being mentioned that the relation with the Gulf are being developed as a counter to Iran's influence in the region. What we saw also in the poll, but beyond, is how much there is an attempt to go beyond that. So we should not let Iran dominate Israel's foreign policy. Yes, there may be joint interests regarding that, but that should not be the lead factor in shaping relations between Israel and regional countries. Because if one such country, whether it's the UAE or the Saudis or others, develop all sort of dialogue mechanism with Iran, will the relation with Israel be necessary to maintain? And our goal is to ensure that there are so many channels of cooperation that go beyond the security, that those relationships will be very diverse. Definitely, if there will be a different administration in the White House with a different policy towards Iran, once again, there will be a gap between the Netanyahu's position, if he's still in power, to what the American administration will lead. I think that our analysis in the past at Mitvim favored diplomatic engagement on the Iranian issue and saw benefits in having Israel's strong allies in the West leading a coherent and coordinated negotiation process with the Iranians as a much more effective way of postponing the Iranian nuclear threat than other things that Israel's prime minister may have been trying to do in recent years.
We also have a question about the Israeli electorate or the Israeli public's sense of security. As a foreign policy institute, we don't generally engage in the question of security or public sense of security. But from your perspective, do the polling results reflect a greater degree of security? And if somebody was trying to understand the Israeli public's sense of overall general security, what institutes are engaging in that kind of work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, first, foreign policy and security go hand in hand, because what we claim domestically is that national security is not only about military. It's also about foreign relations and the ability to cooperate and to engage and to reach out and develop relations on the global stage. So foreign policy is a part of security, and if Israel's global standing will be higher, then by definition, I think the sense of security will be better. So it's not a direct question about security, but definitely the sense that Israel is more able to cooperate in the Middle East, I think relates to a higher sense of security. Because, these are countries that we used to be at war with. And if now we are talking about whether it's economic cooperation or security cooperation or civilian cooperation, that's a totally different mindset. There are institutions looking at that, some from a political psychology aspect, like the Accord Institute at the Hebrew University, some from a more kind of democracy angle, like the Israel Democracy Institute. So there are places to go beyond the typical national security think tanks that are quite a lot of, like the INSS and the IPS. All of them are providing analysis and polling data on security issues, which could also give a picture on those topics as well.
There's a question about the relative importance of external affairs, including relations with the Palestinians, vis-a-vis internal domestic issues when they go to the polls Is there any pattern of change going on here? To what degree do foreign policy considerations, and I think if you could just add a few comments to whether from your perspective or from the data highlighted in the poll over the course of many years, there's any kind of indication as to whether the engagement with Palestinians is viewed as a domestic issue versus a foreign policy issue. How do those all affect Israeli voters when they, go to the poll in 4 or 5 months?
So security issues are very dominant and are played for political reasons by different sides of the political map. So we spoke about Iran. Iran was definitely a tool in domestic politics. We spoke about annexation that was also voiced before election cycles. So we see how specific issues are being played for domestic politics. But also we saw, I think in the last couple of years, the specific goal of Netanyahu to present himself as a very major global leader. We remember there were big posters all across Israel of Netanyahu shaking hands with Trump and with Putin and with Modi. We had visits over for all kinds of leaders, some of them not the ones we would like to see here, like Orban or Bolsonaro and others, kind of portraying the success in the global arena. Even when Israel is combating COVID-19, you will hear the prime minister speak time and time again about how Israel is successful compared to other countries, how Israel is helping and sharing knowledge with other countries about how to deal with the pandemic. So this notion of being a leading actor on the global stage, I think is becoming important in the messaging of the prime minister, plus his ability to open up new areas of cooperation, especially with the countries in the Middle East. Since, let's say, summer of 2014, we've been hearing Netanyahu talk about the better relations that he's orchestrating with Arab countries, and the agreement signed with UAE and Bahrain is definitely, from his point of view, a major achievement, putting a stamp to the rhetoric he's been using over the last few years. The ability of him, as he perceives it, to impact American positions on Iran is also being reflected to the Israeli public as a foreign policy achievement. So I think that linkage is happening. It's a lot about how do you utilize your political benefits over your political rivals in the foreign policy arena. Netanyahu is dominating Israel's foreign policy for the last few years. Most of the things that are happening on the foreign relations field are associated with him specifically. That's why we have to look closely at how Gabi Ashkenazi is handling himself in the position of foreign minister and where he tries to create a niche for himself, doing things differently than what Netanyahu was doing. And therefore, when he goes to visit Berlin and meet the foreign affairs ministers of all the European Union countries, that is a very clear difference than what Netanyahu has been doing as foreign minister. When he has reservations on the language that the Hungarian foreign minister is voicing after the conversation that he had with him, that's also something that differentiates his attitude to foreign policy than the one of Netanyahu's. We'll see how much he's able to create this niche for himself and how much impact that will have on the political debate.
Let's talk about the EU just for a second. Obviously, the data from the poll indicates that many Israelis perceive of the EU as a foe. Despite that, we know that the European Union is Israel's #1 economic partner. It's a privileged partnership. Israelis travel to and around Europe without the need of a visa. There are opportunities for R&D and EU programs, and now the Association Council is being resumed after years of kind of lack of activity. So, from your perspective, do you think that, or do you want to wager a guess that the engagement between Israel and the European Union is going to swing back in public opinion? Because obviously public opinion may not necessarily reflect the formal state engagement and the way that the Israeli government perceives the nature of its relationship with the European Union or various European states. But do you see these other aspects of the bilateral relationship having a positive impact on Israeli public opinion in the coming years?
First, the suspension of annexation creates a window of opportunity to improve Israel-EU relations because the threat of annexation in the West Bank led multiple European leaders to voice time and time again their opposition to such a step, warning Israel of consequences that such a move will have on Israel-Europe relations. So the language was a confrontational one. Since annexation went off the agenda, and since Foreign Minister Ashkenazi has been speaking repeatedly about the need to improve relations with the EU, then Israelis are hearing more of a positive tone about these relations. If that will eventually lead to the resumption of the Israel-EU Association Council, which we are not sure yet, but that's a high-level political dialogue mechanism for both sides. It doesn't mean that when they convene, they have to agree on everything. Most likely they will not, but it will reflect that things are going better also on the political level, not only on the economy or in the research and the sports and culture. Plus, I know that there are efforts by the Europeans looking at how they can improve their engagement with Israelis and how they can improve their image in Israel. So I think if all sides are looking into ways to move things forward and are reflecting that in their engagement with their own public and are not using that as kind of a political tool to bash each other, or if Israel does not step up its engagement with the V4, with the Visegrad countries that are like going against Brussels, like Hungary and others, I think that will create a more positive environment. And it relates also to the question about Germany that was voiced before. If Germany is a key ally of Israel, and Germany being such an important driver within the EU mechanism, I think that bilateral relations, as we see now with the German presidency of the EU, can also lead to improvement on Israel-EU relations as a whole. When Foreign Minister Mas is helping Israel reconvene the Association Council, that not only ingrains Germany as an ally of Israel, it also helps Israel and the EU improve the relationship. And should there be a Biden administration, I think that could also play a place where the American can take a role. We saw in the past American administrations help Israeli and European leaders come closer together.
There's a question as well about what will happen with Israeli public opinion if the results of the US election in a few weeks' time are different than how Israelis were polled, at least in our poll and seemingly other polls as well. How it's going to influence public opinion, or should we wait for the next Mitvim Index, which of course there will be another Mitvim Index. I think in brief, what's important, and I think that what the poll reflects, is that there's a relationship, strong relationship, between how the Israeli public perceives bilateral relations based on the engagement between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Israel. We know that President Barack Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu had a difficult relationship, to say the least, with one another. And in some ways, we can say that impacted or influenced Israeli public opinion when gauging or trying to assess the bilateral relationship, even though when it came to security cooperation, economic cooperation, etc., there was no meaningful or residual impact from the engagement between the two heads of state. And during the course of the Trump administration, the polling data has indicated that Israelis view the relationship more favorably. So a lot of it is associated to or related to who the president is and what kind of relationship they have with the prime minister. If we were to wager a guess, we know that Vice President Biden, if he were elected president, has been in American politics for 40 years, over 40 years, has a long relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. In all likelihood, the relationship between the United States and Israel, at least at the highest level, is not likely to see the low marks that we witnessed during the Obama administration. But a lot of it depends on American policy vis-a-vis Iran, American policy vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But at the very least, those two leaders have a long history and rapport with one another. But let's wait and see in a year and see how Israelis feel, depending on what the results are in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and I will add, Gabi, a word to that, because traditionally, the day after American presidential elections, Israelis are worried. Now, if you look at the previous presidents being elected, the initial response was one of reluctance. Going back from Clinton, maybe even to George Bush, definitely with Obama, also even with Trump. So that's kind of a general or typical Israeli approach to changes on the global arena. First, let's see what negative thing could happen, and only then seek the opportunities. think that's something we're trying to reverse at Mitvim, to bring the discourse about opportunities to be the first one that Israelis are using when to try to think how to leverage and engage in the global arena.
Yeah. I think that perhaps this is a good question to end on. Maybe not the most positive, but a good question to end on. The big theme of this entire year has been the outbreak of the coronavirus and how it's affected everyone's lives around the world, and of course impacted the nature of foreign policy and international relations. So how could the coronavirus pandemic impact Israeli foreign policy in the coming year or years to come?
It's also a question that relates to how it will impact the global order. And I think from our ideological point of view as an institute, we would like to see the coronavirus era end with increased multilateralism, increased cooperation, engagement, solidarity between peoples, between countries. And we would like to see Israel be part of that. We did have a finding in the poll that we didn't have time to present here, which went against this trend and hope, because when we asked Israelis whether they think Israel should act alone fighting coronavirus in Israel, also give a helping hand to countries in the world in their combating against the pandemic, a very clear majority was supporting Israel to take care of its own business, kind of a very inward-looking approach that in a way is in contrast to what we've been seeing happening over the last 6 months or so, because the coronavirus did enable initially Israelis and Palestinians to cooperate on the unofficial levels. It did help the cooperation between Israel and the UAE to move forward. There was also cooperation between Israel and Turkey. We have Roy Gilad, a representative in Ankara, who's been leading that. That was also happening, some positive news on Israel-Turkey relations. We saw global leaders sitting together, including the Israeli Prime Minister. So in a way, we saw Israel becoming part of this family of nations and looking how to assist regional countries and benefit from them. So I think that's the trend we would like to see, seeing Israel as much more open to the international community, in more of an outward-looking foreign policy approach, an international approach that seeks how to help resolve global challenges and not only take care of its own business. So I think that's the hope that we can get something positive out of this period that we are all experiencing.
If I could add just a quick sentence. I do think that it's important just to remind our audience that when the poll was taken in the middle of September, Israelis were on the verge of a second lockdown, and were in at least hopefully the final days of that lockdown. So it's possible that the response to the poll was a reflection of a feeling of inward isolation and a concern about the situation within Israel itself. It would be interesting to see in 6 months' time, hoping that the situation both in Israel and across the world improves, as to how Israelis would respond to the same question.
Thank you. And we would like to add by thanking again to our friends at the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, their support to this project and to Mitvim throughout the year that the poll is being conducted is crucial to us, and we value it a lot, and we appreciate this partnership. We have been sending out to our mailing list, just as we are speaking here, the full findings of the poll. You also see in the chat the link to the poll on our website, so you can take a look at the numbers. If you have any questions or follow-up, feel free to send us an email. We're glad that at least this coronavirus era enables us to engage with our international friends, and we are thankful to the ambassadors and diplomats that joined us today, and especially to the partners from Arab and Muslim countries that took the time and joined to hear and to listen about Israel's foreign policy. So we hope it will be a positive year for Israel's foreign policy and to the peoples of the region and the world, and that we see you again in other Mitvim events in the future. We have our annual conference coming up on October 28th, again in partnership with the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, and you will be receiving the invitation shortly via your email. So thank you again. Thank you, Gabi. Thank you to all the Mitvim colleagues that were here with us today, and see you next time.